Series. As you all can see, this meeting will be recorded. So if anyone from your team has missed this opportunity, it will be available on the bcyfund.org website shortly after the session. Today, we have the honor of having Rachel Dolcine, who is a part of our technical assistance team, provide the webinar around Nonprofits 101. So this webinar is not only directed to individuals who have just started their nonprofit, but also those who might have missed some of those foundational pieces that we have when we are passionate, right, about our projects. And there are some items that we might have missed or overlooked and what we need some more support on. So with Rachel's guidance, she's going to give us some tips, some best practices, some strategies to attain some of those fundamental items to support the growth and the sustainability of our nonprofit organizations. If you have any questions as we move through this presentation, please use the question and answer function on the bottom of the Zoom platform. So it says Q&A. We would rather the questions go into the Q&A function and not the chat function, because sometimes those questions can get lost. So we want to make sure that we are giving attention and supporting the needs that you might have. So please, Rachel, go right ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieta. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Kate, I'm excited to be here this morning to talk about nonprofit basics. I'm extremely passionate about nonprofits, and so this particular topic is exciting for me. So I am glad to be here. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I think someone said they can't hear anything. Can everyone hear me? I want to make sure everyone's hearing me.
I can hear you.
Okay, all right, great. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so I can start the presentation. All right, so today we are going to be talking about the Nonprofit 101, the basics. And as Kata mentioned in her introduction, this particular webinar is for nonprofits who are in any year of existence, whether you just started or you've been around for a long time. This will be a great refresher for you if you've been around for a long time as you move forward with completing your grant application. And if you're a newbie, the information here will also be very helpful for you as you begin to lay the foundation for the projects that may be associated with this particular grant, but also just for general purposes and general nonprofit health and wellness of the organization. What we'll talk about today is going to be very important. I'm a licensed nonprofit consultant. I've been doing nonprofit consulting for many, many years, been in the sector for well over 2 decades. And so I'm hoping that the information that I share today, as well as any questions that I can answer, will offer some value to you. All right, so let's get started. So I am a member of Grow Charities, and Grow Charities events supports Black, Indigenous, people of color, led and BIPOC serving nonprofit organizations. And we do that in 4 ways: event planning, organizational and program development, racial equity and inclusion training, professional development, and wellness workshops. And why is that important? Because we are committed to doing the work to decrease the impact of trauma and dismantle systemic racism within philanthropy and the nonprofit sector. All right, so what are we learning today? But by the time we're done, what's going to happen? So one, you're going to be able to define mission and vision statements. Lots of times nonprofits may get those confused, but they are clearly 2 very distinct statements. And we're going to talk about what they are, why they're important, because these are the guiding lights for the work that you do. I always tell my clients that the mission and the vision statements are your North Star, right? They're the guiding light, your fixed point that you consistently follow to make sure that you're on track. Identify the steps for starting a nonprofit organization in the state of Maryland. The duties of a nonprofit board of directors, another area in which nonprofits may struggle, is actually in recruiting and retaining board of directors, but also making sure the board is educated and equipped to take care of their responsibilities. And then we're going to talk about how nonprofits can fund their programs so that they can set goals for sustainability. And obviously, the Grassroots Fund, which is a grant fund, is one way that nonprofit grants are one way that nonprofits can fund their programs, but we're going to talk about a few more as well. As Kieta mentioned, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A portion of this Zoom platform. I'll repeat that a couple times throughout this presentation because I know some folks may be joining a little later. So put it in there and we will get to your questions. All right, so let's start off by talking about some myths. In the work that I do, there are a plethora of myths around nonprofits. These are normally the three most popular. First, that nonprofits cannot make a profit. You absolutely must. A nonprofit is a business. And I always say, what's the business? You're in the business of doing good. And let me tell you, as someone who's been a part of several nonprofit boards and have been in this sector for a long time, doing good is expensive. It costs a lot of money to do good. It is not cheap to do good. And so it is very important that nonprofits are sustainable, right? That you are ensuring that the organization is financially sustainable, it's financially healthy, and you should make a profit. The difference between a nonprofit and a for-profit business when it comes to making a profit is all the money that's made. So if you have an excess that's made in a particular year, the following year, all that money has to go back into the programs. No one can pocket that for themselves, right? But it's really important to understand that making a profit is okay. It's all right. The founder owns the nonprofit. Oh my goodness. No. Nonprofits are not owned by anyone. It doesn't matter which state you're in this country. Nonprofit is not owned by anyone. Nonprofits are owned by the people of that state, and they are governed and managed by a board of directors that's voted in or selected, right? So the founder of the organization does not have the final say, does not own. And sometimes people say, my nonprofit, the nonprofit that I own. No, a nonprofit is not a private business in that sense. It is not owned by anyone. All the decisions that are related to the nonprofit, when it comes to governance, when it comes to the direction the nonprofit is going in, when it comes to how the money is spent, has to be approved by the board of directors and guided by the organization's bylaws. Qualify for grants. Yes, that's a myth. Just because you're a 501c3 does not mean that you will automatically qualify for grants. I always tell folks, getting your 501c3 gets you in the room. It does not get you a seat at the table, but it gets you in the room. That's all that does, right? All the 501c3 does, it says you are now in position, you can now be invited into the room to apply for or seek grants or seek funding. It is not an automatic thing. You have to do the work. You have to be able to show that your nonprofit is viable, and you have to be able to prove your outcomes, right? And outputs and all those wonderful things that we do, and be tracking that and be financially responsible. There's so many other pieces that go into the process before a nonprofit can even qualify for a grant. All right, so first things first. What is a nonprofit? It's a legal entity, organized and operated, and it could be by a collective of people. It can be by a public organization or a public agency. It could also be for social benefits, and they fall under the 501c IRS tax category. There are about 15 or 16, I believe, don't quote me, there are about 15 or 16 different C categories. The most common C category in the nonprofit sector is C3. So you hear 501c3, which most of you, if not all of you, who are on here now and who will be watching this on replay, probably fit in that particular category. All right, a nonprofit is in the business of doing good. as I mentioned before, it's really important to have the mindset that you are running a business and to ensure your board also has that mindset. You are running a business. What is your business? Doing good. All right, mission and vision. I'll start with the vision statement first, and then I'll move over to mission statements. So the vision statement for a nonprofit describes the organization's purpose, the value. Oops, sorry, I switched. Sorry. You see that I have, see what happens when you're when you work late at night? All right, so where it says vision statement, that's actually the mission statement. And where it says mission statement is actually the vision statement. Please forgive me. I'll make those edits later. So a mission statement describes the organization's purpose, the value delivered, what groups are served, and how services provided. So when you write your mission statement, it should be a short, succinct, very clear statement that answers and that describes your purpose, the value delivered, what groups you serve, and how services provided. So a sample mission statement is to inspire healthier communities by connecting people to real food. Right? Vision statement, which is the one in the green, I know it says mission statement. So a nonprofit's vision statement is a short phrase that describes the future it is ultimately working towards, right? So this is an ideal statement. So your vision statement is ideally, all things being equal, you reach all the goals you want to reach. What is the ultimate destination? What is the desired end outcome of the work that you are doing, right? So for Amnesty International, it's a world in which every person enjoys all the human rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments, right? So a world in which every person, so Amnesty International's vision is ideal, right? Every person, that's gonna take years and years and years and years and years because people have been born all the time and there's lots of people in the world, right? So this is a vision statement because it is saying what the organization hopes to accomplish if it meets all its goals, all things being equal, what would it like to accomplish, right? So your mission statement, your purpose, the value, the group served, and how the service is provided. And your vision statement is an ideal statement. So what is the outcome that you want the organization to have in order to, and I always look at it this way, if the organization ever stopped existing, what would be all the things that you would need to accomplish? What would you need to accomplish, right? And that would be your vision statement. All right, what are the steps for starting a nonprofit? And some of you, all of you on here, if you're a 501c3, you should have gone through this. But I'm going to review it again anyway, just in case there were any steps that were missed, and to make sure that you clearly understand what the process is. So before a nonprofit is even started, research a startup budget, gather your tribe, and your tribe should not be your friends and family, right? You need to gather a tribe of like-minded individuals who are going to be committed to the work. Because as you know, and if you don't know yet, you will learn that your board, which your tribe will convert into once you start this nonprofit, is the heartbeat of the organization. If you do not have a strong board, the organization will not be viable. There's absolutely no way that a nonprofit can exist, a healthy nonprofit can exist or exist in the long term without a healthy board, right? So research, create a startup budget. How much is it gonna cost to start this nonprofit? And how much would it cost to run the nonprofit for the first year? You gotta have those numbers. Gather your tribe, and these are folks who, when you're recruiting them, you're thinking about them eventually becoming the board of directors, and then get your head in business mode. I will say this several times throughout this presentation, right? You are running a business. This grant that you are applying for, you can look at this grant as an investor, right? This is an investor who is offering to invest money in the work that you are doing. As a business, why should they? What do you have going on to convince this investor and convince this funder that you are the best organization in which they should invest their money to see outcomes, better outcomes in the community? You gotta get in business mind, business mode. First, you register the charity with the state of Maryland, and you also get an EIN number. during this process. Once the state of Maryland has said, yep, you're good to go, you are now a registered charity, that does not mean that you are tax exempt or tax free. Nope. Charity is just another business option in the state of Maryland. This does not make you tax free or tax exempt. After you've registered with charity with the state of Maryland and you've gotten your certificate, you then move on to the IRS to complete the 1023 or 1023-EZ form. And that really depends on the size of the nonprofit and how much income you expect to make within the first 3 to 5 years. Once you complete this application, which can take from 90 days to 6, 7, 8 months for you to get a response. If you do the 1023-EZ, normally within 90 days, you get a response. If you do the 1023, which is just a regular application, it can take several months. And that's a more cumbersome application. So once you make the application to the IRS, you then wait for the IRS to send you a letter that says, we've determined that you qualify. You are now a 501c3 tax exempt organization. So it's not the state who determines that you're tax exempt, it's the federal government. All right, so you receive your IRS Tax Determination Letter. Save that letter because you're going to need that letter to provide for a variety of different business purposes, from opening a bank account to there are some grants that will ask you for copies of that. You may also need to send it in if you're seeking a sponsorship, of in-kind sponsorship or monetary. They may ask to see a copy of your IRS Tax Determination Letter. So that's really important for you to keep in a safe space. I always encourage that you scan and upload it to a drive. Create a drive that the board works from, whether it's Google or a Dropbox or Trello or wherever you're working from, and upload a copy of this document, just in case the physical copy gets misplaced, that you have one you can print out. After you have completed, after you've received your letter, you then need to go back to the state of Maryland, the Secretary of State, and you need to complete the exempt organization fundraising notice. You are not permitted to fundraise in Maryland, actually in any state in the US, unless you have permission in that state to fundraise. You will need to get permission to fundraise if you're actively fundraising in Florida, if you're actively fundraising in Illinois, in California, wherever. You will need to apply to those states to get permission to fundraise. But we're talking about Maryland here, right? So to fundraise in Maryland, you have to put in an application. It needs to be approved, and that application is renewed. Your status is renewed every year. Every single year on a particular date, you will have to send in documentation to the Office of the Secretary of State, and they will renew your permissions for another year. Failure to do this can result in legal action by the Secretary's office. It can also result in fines. It can also result in you losing your nonprofit status, right? So it's really important that we remember this. Then you can apply for a tax exempt certificate, so that when you go to shop certain items, and make sure you understand which items can be tax exempt and which are not. When you go shop for certain items, that you do not have to pay taxes. This tax exempt certificate can also be used for online purchases. So if you purchase from Amazon, from Walmart, from Dollar Tree, from wherever online, you can actually send them this tax exempt certificate. They will link it to your account so that when you make purchases online, you do not have to pay tax on that either. All right, before I get into important documents, are there any questions about starting a nonprofit? Do we have any questions about anything I've spoke about so far?
There's some questions in the Q&A box.
Okay, hold on, let me move this little thing right here.
Also support in reading the questions for you, Rachel.
Yes, please.
Recently hearing the term chair board, who would make up the chair board of an organization?
All right, so the chair of the board is the equivalent to the president of the board. It's just a position. So it's just one position on the board. So when you have a board of directors, you have the chair or the president, depending on what you want to call them, right? So either chair or president. You have the vice chair or vice president, secretary, and treasurer. Those are the 4 officers that make up a board. In addition to the 4 officers that I just mentioned, those positions, you can also have board members, which are folks who are on your board who do not have an officer position. So the chair of the board is just an officer position.
It's clear. So the next question from Monique, hi Monique, is the executive director, the director referenced D&O insurance, and the officer, the executive board only?
I'm not clear on that question, Monique. So if you can rephrase that for me, that would be great. I'm not clear on what you're asking, unless Kiera, Monique, if you can just rephrase that for me.
Yeah. And Samira wants to know the 1023 easy or 1023, which is better?
So the 1023 easy is easiest. You can do it online. It takes maybe about upwards of an hour, depending on the paperwork you have. But for the 1023 easy, it locks you into a certain amount of income every year. I believe for the first, you have to make less than $50,000 each year for the first 3 years that you exist. So the 1023 locks you into a certain income. The 1023 is a longer application. You have to provide a whole lot more documentation for that application, but you don't have the income lock-in, for lack of a better word. So deciding which one to do, it's really going to depend on what is your projected income for the first 3 years. And it's not first 3 years combined. So each year you can't exceed a certain amount of income. So really that depends on how much income you anticipate providing. Sorry, how much income you anticipate receiving.
Mm-hmm. Monique rephrased the question. So in regards to D&O insurance, is the director, the executive director, and the O referring to the board? Oh, okay.
Okay, so no. So the D&O is directors and officers. So officers are the 4 that I just talked about. Your chair or vice chair, your chair or president, your vice chair or vice president, your secretary, and your treasurer. Those are the officers. Directors are anyone else who's sitting on your board. So anyone who does not have a officer position is categorized legally as a director. So that's all that means. So no, it's not the ED. You have a separate liability insurance that covers staff. The D&O covers is board insurance. And so you should have separate insurance that covers your paid staff.
That was the last question.
Okay. All right, so let's keep going. Also, one more thing about the D&O, it can also cover volunteers as well. So if you're ED, if you're a totally volunteer-led organization, let me put that caveat, make sure you talk to your insurance carrier to discuss if that's included or added on that particular component for that as well. I do want to add that piece in because I know some may be volunteer only, there's no paid position. Okay, let's keep going. All right, what are some important documents? And later in this presentation, I am going to connect some of these documents with what is required for you to submit when you're completing your Grassroots fund application. And you will see why it's so very, 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 very important that you have these documents on hand, because when you have them on hand, when you fill out grant applications or for a sponsorship, you don't have to go running around trying to find these pieces. They exist, and you're really just copy, pasting, and tweaking, right? It's really important to keep these on hand. So for governing, which is your board, right? The board is the entity that governs the organization. They should have an articles of incorporation, which is something you should have completed, and your bylaws when you applied that, when you completed that 1023 easy or the 1023, your articles of incorporation, your bylaws, your conflict of interest policy and disclosure should all be completed and available, right? The articles of incorporation speaks to the organization generally, right? What city and state you're registered in, just some general information about the organization. The bylaws are the rules by which the board governs itself. So the bylaws can include terms of board service. It can include what happens if a board member steps off the board before their term is up. It should include conflict of interest and disclosing that, and what happens, what's the process for conflict of interest. It should also include pieces around social media. So for the board, how is that going to be handled? What can the board post via social media? If you're representing the organization, what can't you post? See what else? How you vote, right? So can you vote by, what's the voting by proxy? If you're not present for a vote, can you vote electronically? How often will your meetings be held? What is a quorum? And a quorum meeting, what's the minimum amount of board officers and directors that need to be present? What's the total amount of board members that need to be present in order for a meeting to be held? That's called a quorum, or in order for a vote to be held, right? So your bylaws is going to be the rules by which the board governs itself. Conflict of interest policy and disclosure is mandatory. And the conflict of interest policy outlines for the organization as a whole, not just for the board, what are the expectations of behavior, what are conflicts, and how conflicts should be reported. And a conflict doesn't necessarily mean, you know, there's a conflict in time or there's a conflict in beliefs, which that also should be part of it because that's important. But also, if you're sitting on a board that services youth, and you're sitting on another board that services youth, you need to disclose that, right? Because what the board discusses, some of what the board discusses is really, I don't want to say private, but for lack of a better word, it's private information to that board. And you need to make sure the board needs to know that you are sitting on another board that has a similar mission as the one that you're sitting on. You may also be going after the same funds, right? So you may sit on two youth boards, and they both may be applying for the Grassroots fund, right? You can disclose that sort of thing. If the board is seeking a vendor, they need a new roof, and the board is seeking a vendor, and a roofing company comes up, and your mom owns that company, or your cousin owns that company, or you happen to work for that company, which the board should know. I'm just using these as really examples. The board needs to know that. Those are some of the conflicts of interest that you should be disclosing. Conflicts of interest disclosures don't mean you cannot be on the board. That's not what that means, unless the board decides that the conflict that you have is cannot be worked around and is just in too much conflict with their mission and with the direction the board wants to go in. But for the most part, what this particular document does, right? It allows the board to make decisions, educated decisions. It allows the board to make educated decisions because we know all the players at the table, what everyone is involved in, so you can move forward. The last thing you need, right, is to go after a particular grant or a particular contract, only to find out that one of your board members has an interest in this, and maybe they have an investment in this company, and they're gonna make money from the organization taking on that client or hiring that particular vendor, right? That's the last thing you don't want to find that out after the fact. All that stuff should be put up front and should be laid on the table for the board to review. And then a board handbook, and the board handbook will cover information that's not in the bylaws. So the articles of incorporation is wide, bylaws are coming a little more, and then the board handbook is the day-to-day operations of the board, right? So you're going to deep dive in certain topics. So you might have a sexual harassment policy that's part of your board handbook. You may have a whistleblower policy that's part of the board handbook. You may also have board meeting attendance policy, right? So if how many meetings can a board member miss before the board has a conversation about how they should continue? You may have details about voting people on and off the board. You may also have details about your committees. What committees are you going to have? And what are the specific mission of each of these committees? What are their tasks? What roles do they have, right? So that's what the board handbook does. Operational, your SOP, your standard operating procedures. This is for the entire organization. So this would be the CEO or the executive director. This would be that person managing the book by which they go by, the rules by which they go by, their guidebook, standard operating procedures for them and the entire organization, all the staff and volunteers. Talent management, your HR manual. Do you have a handbook or some policy around volunteers? And then performance evaluations. And performance evaluations should not just be for paid employees. Your board should also be doing performance evaluations, right? Board members should also be involved in this process. The board should be evaluated and board members should also be evaluated. Once again, back to business mindset. Just because the board or volunteers are volunteering or giving their time does not mean that you should not be thinking business mindset quality. You want to run a quality program. You want to run a quality organization, and that's going to mean accountability. And then financial. What are your financial procedures for issuing checks, for signing of checks? If someone needs a reimbursement, what's the process for that? Do you have a bookkeeper? What is the role of the chief financial officer? What are the checks and balances to make sure that there is no improprieties that are going on as far as the financials are concerned? And then relevant tax filings and due dates. This is so important. In the state of Maryland, every year you have to complete a property tax return. It's free to complete it, but you have to complete it. You have to complete a federal tax return every single year. If you are a small organization and you've brought in less than $20,000 for the year, I think it's $20,000, all you need to do is complete a postcard. It's a couple of questions, yes, 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 no, 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 and you submit it. Everyone else, you need to complete a 990, right? So it could be the 990, the short form, because you brought in under a certain amount, or it could be the 990, the long form, but you have to complete a federal tax return. Every year, you also have to renew your charity registration. Those three things in the state of Maryland. If you do not renew those, or if you do not file those, it is public record. Anyone from off the street can ask you to see your financials, can ask to see your tax returns. They can actually go on any of these websites, the IRS website, the charity registration website, the property tax website, and check. Have you completed all your filings? Are you up to date? Are you in good standing with the state? When donors want to give to you, they can go and they can check all these things. It's really, really important. And it's important for us, grassroots organizations, right? Organizations who are serving communities of color. It's really important that when we look at nonprofit work, when we look at the work that we're doing, that we consider this to be a part of excellence, right? We should have no other standard but excellence. And what that means that all our ducks are in a row and we are making sure that we are running a business that's on the up and up and a business that is keeping track of all these important documents. All right, so I went ahead and I put some of the documents that are required, like some of the forms and some of the things you have to fill out for the Grassroots Fund, right? These two point to a budget. One of the first things I mentioned, before you even fill out the application for the state to register as a charity, you need to have a startup budget. And every year, the board, it's the board's responsibility to approve budgets. If you have paid staff, if you have an executive director or a chief executive officer, their team, their leadership team, the paid organization leadership team can create the budget. The budget then goes to the board. The board has to review it. If they have questions or edits or whatever the case is, they send it back. But that budget, money should not be spent in a new program year unless the board has approved that budget. If you have an organization that's 100% volunteer run, it's the board's responsibility to create that budget, approve the budget, so that money can be spent. You should not be going there should be no year at all that you do not have a budget. Why is that important? Because when you have applications like this, guess what? One less thing for you to worry about. You grab your budget, and you're able to fill in all these numbers. If you don't currently have a budget, the sheet on the left, the one that says that has budget section and description, what is listed here is a great start of expenses, right? So these are all some of the expenses that can be related to nonprofit. So you can look at this and you can start a budget by using this as your template. But having a budget means that this particular form is easily completed. You're just punching those numbers, right? Just on the right-hand side, also questions that can be answered from your budget, either from this year's budget or from last year's budget. And budgets should not just be created and just be put to the side. Okay, we created our budget. Every time you have a board meeting or when you have a leadership with your leadership staff, or if you have departments, you should be checking in to see the income and the expenditures. How do they line up with what's in the budget, right? Every time the board makes a decision about a purchase, you should be checking that budget. Where are we in terms of being on target or being on par with the budget that we set for ourselves when it comes to revenue, when it comes to expenses, right? We all have a personal budget. You know you can't spend money you don't have. So if you haven't brought the money in, you can't spend it, right? Also with a budget, you have restricted and you have unrestricted giving. And this goes for any particular type of money that you get in. If you get this funds from BCYF, the Grassroots Fund, this would be considered restricted giving. What does restricted giving mean? It means the money that you will get can only be used for the purposes outlined in this by the fund. So you can't take this money and pay your rent. You can't take this money and pay for items or supplies or anything that's not related to the specific program that the fund approved this for. That's restricted giving. The same thing with donations, right? If somebody writes you a check for $500 and in the memo, they said for the Henry Fund, the only place that money can go is a Henry Fund, and the only things or expenses that can be charged to that revenue is anything related to the Henry Fund. That's restricted funds. Unrestricted funds is money that you get that can be used for whatever the organization needs. So if you have online giving, or as you do your giving campaigns, make sure that you're giving folks the option. Because if all you have on your website is a list of programs and that folks can give to specific programs, you're pigeonholing yourself. If you don't have an option where folks can give to wherever the organization has the greatest need, right? Your staffing, your overhead, rent, all that stuff goes into running the organization. Those are all expenses. You have to ensure that when you're looking at your budget, when you're looking at the way that you make income, that you are making sure that you have a healthy restricted revenue and unrestricted revenue as well, right? So these particular documents point to the importance of having a budget. And it's not just a grassroots fund that's going to ask you for this information. Any grant that you seek is going to ask you about your financial information as well. All right, we talked about mission and vision statements, right? So the organization information document for the Grassroots Fund, this is where you put this information, right? So how did the organization start? What is your mission and vision for the long-term impact of the organization? If you have these statements already in place, guess what you're doing? Copy, paste, copy, paste. It's a wonderful feeling. You don't have to scramble to make these, to find them. You don't have to scramble to develop or come up with these particular statements. If the foundation is laid from the very beginning, these applications become less scary, become less cumbersome because you have you've gathered all the information already, right? How does your organization's values align with BCYF? Do you even know what the BCYF values are, right? And that's a quick look at the website, or the information may be contained in the instructions, right? And so you look at your own values. What are the values for this organization? And how do they line up? What are some examples of that? And then what does your organization do? So you take that mission statement, because remember, you're talking about the value added to the communities, who you serve, where you serve and what you do. You take that mission statement and you just expand it, right? So once again, mission and vision statement, two very simple statements can be used as a starting point for this entire document right there, right here, and you're just adding meat to those bones. Same question here about the communities that you serve, right? Part of your mission statement is who do you serve and where? So even if you say, okay, we serve the 21215, I'm just pulling out a zip code. I'm hoping it's a zip code that exists in Baltimore, right? So 21215, let's say that's a zip code that you serve. 21215 may have different communities within that zip code, right? You may have different types of people. You may serve families or the young people, a particular school in this community. But it's a starting point. That mission and vision statement is a starting point. Tracking the work that you do. You should be tracking the work that you do year after year. It's a good idea to do an annual report. So if you do an annual report every year, where you share with the community, you share with your donors, you share with folks who've given you funding, you share what your organization has done over the course of that year, that's another document you can pull from when you're completing an application like this, right? Because this seeks to engagement and relationship. And that's really what funding is about. Whenever an organization or a foundation or even a government agency gives money, and they give money to organizations over and over and over, in many cases, maybe not all, and I'm sure those will be those of you who may disagree, but in most cases, it's built on relationships, right? It's built on outcomes. It's built on you as an organization, proving that you are capable of managing not just the funds that you were given, but you are capable of taking these funds and multiplying it, right? You are taking these funds and you are growing the program. So the next time around, they could say, wow, we give this organization $25,000 and they took that $25,000 and turned it into $1 million, right? It's really important to have those types of, to track your outcomes, to track your goals, to track the work that you've done, and not just in numbers, which is called quantitative data, but also qualitative. What is the community saying? How are people feeling about your work? How have lives been changed about your work? Collecting that data too is really important because it helps you to answer these questions. All right, remember I talked about those important documents and your tax filings and how all that was important? Your organization status. This particular application requires that you have a copy of your most recently submitted 990. So you got to have that on hand. And if you haven't completed it yet, you use the one from last year because it's the most recently submitted, right? If you have a fiscal sponsor, then you will do the what's needed there. But have a copy of your Maryland Good Standing Certificate from the Maryland State Department of Assessments and Taxation. This is where this points to those personal property tax returns that you have to complete every year. If you don't complete them, you are not in good standing with the state. And so you are not going to be able to get a certificate from the Maryland State Department of SDAT. I just call them SDAT. We'll just say SDAT. Too much to say all this over and over. So SDAT, you are not going to be able to provide this, right? So it goes back to what I was saying before. It's important that we stay on top of the legal and the financial obligations that we have as organizations. All right, any questions before I move on to next section? Keeping the lights on. Okay, let me see. I think I can click Q&A.
2 questions in the chat. So the Samira had a follow-up question regarding the 1023. The question is, so income regarding the 1023 is total grants received or surplus money made?
So the 1023 is all it has your account for all the funds you brought in. Fundraising, it could be grants. It asks you for specific types of revenues that you've had over the course of the year. So it's not just grants that are on there. They ask for other types of income as well.
Mm-hmm. Monique has another question. So to verify, our BCYF budget isn't our entire budget. It's only the expenses we plan to cover with BCYF funds.
Kiera, you can probably Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's correct.
That is correct, right? And some orgs have the BCYF funds as their entire program. So that would be that particular program and it's funded, through BCYF funds, but it could also be a partial payment. So your EED is working and they're only working 50% of the time on this BCYF project, and the other 50% is on a different grant. As long as, that's in your budget and it's clearly laid out, that should be okay as well.
Okay. All right, thank you. Great questions, great questions. All right, so we are going to go on to the last portion of this particular webinar. We're going to talk about keeping the lights on, right? So you've started a nonprofit. So how do you keep the lights on? How do you keep the nonprofit viable? How do you keep it sustainable? How do you keep it so that long after both you and I are gone, this organization still exists and the impact continues to increase, not decrease as time goes by? So one, you need to ensure that you have the proper structure, right? For the organization, you need to make sure you have the proper structure for the organization. Sorry, I'm trying to move this out of the way because it's in my way. All right, the proper structure for the organization, and the structure is board of directors. Board of directors. The board of directors is the top. If this was a pyramid, this would be the top of the pyramid. Board of directors. The board of directors supervises the CEO and the executive director. So the board of directors is the entity that hires, fires, and also holds accountable the CEO and the executive director. The CEO or executive director then manages their executive or their management team, and then the management team manages frontline staff, right? So that is a nonprofit structure, and you need to ensure that the structure you have falls in line with best practices. Board fiduciary duties. And I want everyone on here to think about this. Does the board of the nonprofit on which you serve clearly understand what their responsibilities are? Not just responsibilities to sit on the board and add it to their resume, but their responsibilities for duty of care, their duties, the responsibilities to these three duties: duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. These are legal duties, legal responsibilities that nonprofit boards have. And if nonprofit boards or individuals on the board are not in compliance with their legal obligations, it can cause some legal problems, to say the least, right? So what does duty of care mean? Duty of care means that it is the board's responsibility to ensure the organization's assets, and that is from money to talent. That means the people that are working for the nonprofit or volunteering, the community they serve, if you own any property, if you have any investments. It's the board's responsibility to make sure that those assets are being used in a prudent and honest manner, right? And this is what goes into the bylaws and also the board manual, right? So that's duty of care. You have to care about the organization's health, the organization's viability, the organization's integrity. You have to care about that as a board member. Duty of loyalty. When you sit on the board of an organization, your loyalty is to that organization, which is why I talked about conflict of interest, right? Because if I sit on two youth organizations who are going after the same funding, right? There might be some conflicts there, right? So the duty of loyalty is while you are serving on any particular board in any capacity, whether you're an officer or you're a director, you have a responsibility to remain loyal to that organization. All the decisions that you make should have that organization's best interest in mind, as well as advancing that organization's mission. Then there's a duty of obedience. It is the board's responsibility to ensure the organization is in compliance with all laws and regulatory bodies. if you're on a board or your board or your board should know, has the 990 been filed? Have we renewed our charity? Have we done our charity renewal? Have we completed our personal tax returns? Our board insurance do we have board insurance? Has it been renewed? How much does it cost? What does it cover? Right? You need to ensure that it is board responsibility to ensure all those things are happening. Reviewing the organization's financials, because it's the board who ultimately decides whether or not an organization will continue to exist. Not the founder. It's the board who decides this organization is no longer viable, we need to shut it down. And then there's a process for that. The board votes, and then there's actually a legal process to dissolve a nonprofit, right? But it's the board who decides all of that. It's the board who decides who's the CEO going to be, or if it's not the CEO, if you use an executive director, they're the ones who hire, fire, and manage that person, right? So the board needs to clearly understand what its responsibilities are. If the organization doesn't have bills and gets sued because it owes money and doesn't have the money to pay it, guess who's responsible for that? Yes, the board is responsible for that. And I know that we've all seen, over the last several years, so many people, public officials who've come under fire, or things that have happened that have ended up in court or ended up in the media around nonprofit board members who do not understand these 3 duties, and in some way, shape, or form violated these duties and ended up either fined or serving time. So there can be legal ramifications for the board for not abiding by these fiduciary duties. All right, making money. Money, right? One of a nonprofit's favorite topic, but also worst topic, because making money can be hard, right? When you have a nonprofit and when you have a board, especially if you have a board who is not business savvy, or a board who doesn't have any business or nonprofit or fundraising experience, it can be hard. But one of the best ways to make money, because you have to make money because you're in a business of doing good, and doing good is really expensive. So you got to make the bacon, you got to make the money. One of the best ways to start making money is to make sure that your board understands its responsibilities and receives some type of training around fundraising. Now, when I talk about fundraising, I'm not talking about selling chocolates. I'm talking about anything that you do, anything the board does, anything volunteers do, anything the organization does to bring in money, it's fundraising. You are fundraising, you are raising funds. Now you can have fundraisers, which we'll talk about in a second, but fundraising is anything that you do to bring in money to the organization. So sometimes you may have a board who has no experience. It's just some really big-hearted people. They want to change the world. They want to make a difference in the community. They're sitting on the board because they think that somehow, some way, they can help you make a difference. But they have never been a part of a fundraiser. They have never asked anyone to give money for a cause. So they need to learn. They need training. So start by training your board on how to fundraise. There's so many different ways to fundraise. And fundraising for a board, or fundraising for anyone that you are tasking with raising money for the organization, it needs to be something that they're comfortable with and that comes natural to them. So for example, one of the boards that I sit on, we have some folks who social media, Facebook fundraisers, no problem. They do it well. They have no problem doing a Facebook fundraiser and getting their folks donate. Another person on the board has had zero success in her network with Facebook fundraisers. However, if she texts her friends and send them a link, they'll donate. If she calls them over for dinner, has a girls' night out, calls them over for dinner and like, look, friends, I'm part of this organization and this is what we're doing. I need everybody to give $50 towards. They'll do it, right? So you have to also understand, you, the board, and your team that's making this money needs to understand what method works best. It's important that you diversify your nonprofit financial portfolio. And I'm going to talk about 6 ways that you can do that. This is not financial counseling. This is just some ideas for you to use to make money. So first is grant. Obviously, that's why we're here, right? Because you are planning to apply for the Grassroots Fund. So grant is money that's given to a nonprofit. It doesn't need to be repaid though, but it's given for a specific reason. And the money needs to be used for that reason, but it does not need to be repaid. Fundraisers can be online, they can be in person, and they're hosted by the nonprofit, or you may have a supporter, right? One of the boards I sit on, we have supporters who every year for their birthday, they do a birthday fundraiser for the organization and we get the funds, right? So it may not be you as the organization doing this fundraiser directly. It might be a supporter, a friend of the organization who's doing the fundraiser for a specific program or for general program expenses. Communicate, if it's a friend or supporter of the organization, communicate with them what your needs are. They may have a program that's dear to their heart and they're like, nope, I want to raise money for the babies because I love the babies and I want to make sure the babies are okay. Or you may have someone else who says, what's your greatest need? I can just do a general fundraiser and donate the funds and you can use it for wherever the greatest need is, right? So make sure you're communicating with your supporters as well. Fees for service. Yes, you don't have to offer everything for free. Yes, I should have put that in the myth section. You can actually charge for certain services, right? A good example of a nonprofit who does that is the YMCA. Anywhere you go in this country, there's a YMCA, they even have them globally. They have services that they charge a fee for. And those fees that they collect from these services then goes back into running the organization. But those are fees that are actually unrestricted funds, right? So they are fees that is for the general running of the particular organization, right? So fees for service. You can also think about leveraging what is something that you offer for free to folks who they can't afford it, that you can put a price tag on and offer to people that can. Fees for service can also be if you offer therapy, right? And they're in a particular community where they may have government assisted help where you can bill Department of Social Services. I shouldn't say therapy. Therapy is just one of the examples I always use. Maybe it's Department of Social Services. Maybe it's another particular government agency that you bill for the services that you provide for this particular family or a particular individual. The individual doesn't come out of pocket, right? But you're providing services for a fee. So it's free for them, but you are billing someone else for the services that you provide, right? That's tutoring. That's another example, tutoring, right? There are families that can afford tutoring. So you would charge a tutoring fee, but you may offer tutoring scholarships to children or the families who may not be able to afford the full fee. So they're getting a partial scholarship, or they may get a full scholarship because they cannot afford anything, right? So really begin to look at what are some of the services that you provide. What are some opportunities that exist in the communities you serve? What are some needs that folks have that basic living needs that they have that they pay funds for anyway, that your organization can help to support or help to fill a gap? Sponsorships. So this normally comes from a business, it can come from another organization, and this is normally given to offset the expenses that's related to a program or an event. Most popularly, it's used for events. So you may be having an event and you ask for sponsors, and they can be in kind or they can be monetary. If you get in-kind donations, the value of that should be accounted for on your budget. So for example, if you have a budget line for websites and it's $1,000 that you intend to spend on a website, and somebody decides that they're going to donate and build your website, that $1,000 is to be accounted for, right? So it's an expense you had and you didn't bring in the actual dollar revenue, right? But it's something that was covered with in-kind donation. You need to make sure you are accounting that also as part of your budget, your budget reconciliation. Social enterprise. So, and what that means is, and once again, I'm not an accountant. I'm just telling you this from just my own experience from being a board chair and having to go through this with our own treasurer, who's a CPA. right? There needs to be accounts and balances. So what comes in always needs to be accounted for, even if it's in kind. If it helps to cover an expense line, then it needs to be accounted for in your monthly, that leads to your annual budget. And you need to make sure you're talking to your accountant and about that. I don't know if necessarily a bookkeeper would know. I've always made it a point to sit on boards where they have a CPA, because CPAs have just a wider scope of understanding tax laws, right? So just a side note. Social enterprise, yes, one of my favorites. Starting a business that supports the nonprofit. Now, in some instances, you may still have sales usage taxes and you may have a business license, but starting a business, there are nonprofits that start rental. They have rental properties, and I know that goes into investment, but they may have an Airbnb. They may have a coffee shop, a laundromat. They may have, let's say, rental properties already, where you not just maybe rent commercial space, but you may also rent apartments, right? As well. So starting a business, you may start a business. You may start a secondhand clothing store, right? Similar to Goodwill. So folks donate clothing, but you resell some of the clothes. Some you may give back to the community or folks who may need it, right? So we're not saying that you charge everyone, but you may have, maybe some of your higher end items or new to gently used items that you may resell in this boutique, this secondhand boutique, as a way to support the organization and the work that you're doing, right? When you start a social enterprise, which is a business, that's where the funds are used to do good, essentially, right? But it supports the organization. You need to ensure that this social enterprise is in line with the work that you're doing, right? So if you're not going to start if you start a cafe, a coffee shop, right? But you're serving youth, how to start in this coffee shop and what you'll be selling and doing in this coffee shop, how does that connect with the work you're doing with youth? And there are obviously ways to connect that. The coffee shop can be a safe space where young people can come. Maybe you have places for them to read. Maybe you have just a quiet spot for them to finish their homework. Maybe you also have a mentoring program, and a coffee shop is where the mentors come in with the mentees. They have a cup of hot cocoa, they have some tea, and they talk, right? How is that social enterprise being used directly? How does it tie into the mission? How does it tie into the goals of your organization or a particular program? You're not just starting a social enterprise all willy-nilly. There needs to be a connection. Another example is I had a young person who aged out of foster care, and she wanted to provide a space where foster youth who aged out, who were in college and had nowhere to go when school was closed during breaks, that they would have a place. So she wanted to take a house and convert it into almost like a property where they can come and they can use some of their the funds they get to support them in school as for housing. But what happens during the downtime when kids are in school? What is going to happen with that property? She can then turn that property into an Airbnb during the times when it's not being used. And folks can know this is a social enterprise, and the funds that are being used here is to maintain this property so that we can provide a space for foster youth who are aging out, right? Social enterprise, connecting it to the mission and what we do. And then investments. Yes, once again, I'm not a financial advisor, but yes, you can have investments. You can have a scholarship fund. That's a mutual fund that grows with interest over time. You can have property. You can own land, right? You can definitely have investments that you can add to the assets of the organization. All right, and then lastly, planning for success. We've talked about a lot today during this webinar, and I'm hoping that the information that was provided was valuable and helpful for you. But how do you begin to plan for success? You've heard me, all this stuff I was talking about today, all this amazing information. How do you plan for success? Create annual goals. Every year, your board should sit. The organization I'm a part of, both of them, we have board retreats. October, November, board retreat. And that's when the board gets together and we do a SWOT analysis. We look at what happened in the current year and how do we make our way forward? What are some of the goals that we want? If you have staff and you have committees, invite everybody, right? And you work on this together. Get the board of directors trained. The board of directors is the heart of the organization, right? Even if you do not get this grassroots grant or the fund. There'll be others. This is important for moving forward. Some of the pieces we talked about, you can't have that. You can't have a financially valuable organization without a board that's strong. You can't have a board, an organization that's in line with its mission and goals unless you have a strong board. Get the board of directors trained. Perfect your story. What is your story? One of the questions for this application is, what is your story? How did you start? What are you all about? Why are you doing this work? Perfect that. Action plan for the first 3 years. I always tell nonprofit startups that, yes, people tell you a business plan. My recommendation is an action plan for the first 3 years. That action plan, as you work out the kinks, as you every year you adjust it, by year number 4, you can then convert it into a business plan. Why? Because you've seen 3 years of, okay, what's happening, the ups and downs. You can tell which months are your highs, which months are your lows, and you can do better predictions for the future. Nonprofits, just like any other business, the first 5 years is critical. The first 3 years, more critical, really important. The first 3 years will definitely define where you go, right? And like I said, create a strategic plan or business plan for years 4 and onward. Some folks do a 5-year strategic plan, some do 10. Older organizations may do even 15 or 20. Now, once they do these strategic plans, they just don't leave it because it's 20 years out. Every single year when they do their annual planning, they pull that out to see where are they in relation to the plans they've made. And then create a calendar of events, whether it's fundraising events, community events that tie into your mission, and then your financial and tax filings, because you do not want to slack on these, right? So your annual charity filing, your 990, your personal property tax, you want to make sure that these are on a calendar so you remember and your board members as well. All right, do I have any additional questions from anyone? We have a little bit of time left. Are there any additional questions that you would like me to answer?
I would just like to say thank you, Rachel. This has been a really informative, interactive, like just very concise nonprofit 101. It's just a wonderful resource that you were able to provide the community, and getting a few shout outs in the chat. People are very thankful for the knowledge that you are sharing. Hey, Tisha. So that's awesome. Thank you for your time and your knowledge and support for grassroots organizations. And I really enjoy how you called out grassroots to have the expectation of excellence as that foundation. And we know we have to show up. We have to be the best in all circles. And hopefully taking this checklist that you provided at the end, this concise summary, we can, even in our TA sessions that are going to go live on April 1st, you can work with a technical assistance provider one-to-one if you need to, and go through maybe 1 or 2 items that are on this checklist and get that support, that targeted support that you need to help grow and sustain your nonprofit organization.
Yep. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Even, you're going to have your TA support, but in the future, if you have, there are grants you may apply for where there's no TA support. It's just directly with the funder. Funders love questions. They love when you ask questions about the process or if you're not clear. So don't ever feel that any question will put you out there. It's better to ask the question and be prepared than not to, and then submit a proposal that could have been better if you had just asked some questions, right? Ask for help when you need it. In our community, a lot of times there are folks who have all the information, they don't want to share it because they'll say, I've invested all this time and getting all the information I have, you got to pay me for this and pay me for that. But let me tell you, there are people out there, Kieta, myself, and others, who, although this is the work that we do for a living, we are vested in ensuring that organizations that serve communities of color, organizations that serve Black communities are thriving. And so don't be afraid to reach out for help and ask questions as you are doing your budgets. I told someone this morning on another call that I had, make sure in your budgets you are budgeting for expert assistance, that you are budgeting for technical assistance that can be offered to your organization so that you can grow. That's one of the areas nonprofits slack on a lot of times because they don't think it's important. It's not as important as developing programs, but it is. You don't know what you don't know, and what you don't know could cost you a grant and could cost you a lot of money in the long run, right? So don't be afraid to ask questions and reach out for help if you need it. And you got to pay the piper, right? You have to be prepared, because you're a business, to spend money on the things that will help you to be, not you, but help the organization to be viable and sustainable in the future.
I have one question that was put into the chat. Cam Green, would organizations that are at the beginning stage qualify for this type of funding? So not having any previous year tax forms. Very good question. Yeah, so we will have to circle back.
Yeah.
Because I know that the tax form is a requirement. And so I guess for further clarification, it's a requirement, right? So some organizations do have fiscal sponsors. So if you don't have that backup documentation, you're not a 501c3, you can partner with an organization who does have that information, does have that documentation, and use them as a fiscal sponsor if you're not ready. But that is a required document, like the 990 is something that is being required for this particular grant.
So that means for those of you, because I talked about doing a postcard if you make under, I think it's $20,000. So that means that for those of you who are bringing in under $20,000, don't do the easy route of just doing the postcard. Do the 990, the short form, right? Because they're short and the long, and just do a full 990, because guess what? The Grassroots Fund is not the only funder who's going to be asking you for a 990. They want to see a breakout of how you're spending your money. That's what that 990 is. The postcard doesn't give them that information. It's a bunch of yes or no, like 10 yes and no questions. So even if you make below the recommended amount that qualifies you to do the postcard, which would be easy because we're doing excellence, right? Just do the 990, because that's information that you're going to need for other funders outside of this one.
So I'll just put in the email address that'll give you access to a technical assistance provider. The email is assistance@bcyfund.org. And within 36 hours, a TA will respond to your email either with an answer, or they'll say we have to get further information, right? So you will receive some type of information, some type of follow-up if you send an email to assistance@bcyfund.org. I see another question from Tiffany. Is it an age requirement for the BCY fund? Now, I haven't had that question before, so we would have to check back in, but age requirement isn't on there. But as Rachel pointed out in the presentation, the organization, right, it doesn't belong to that one person. So if that person has others on their board who are supporting and guiding, and they have the documentation and they have the support, BCYF advocates for intergenerational programming, board development, all of those, growing the village, right? Having the village support in the programming. So it wouldn't be attached to that one individual, I don't believe. It would be a project of a number of people. Yes. Because, yeah, that makes clear sense. Thank you, Tiffany.
So thank you all so much. Here at Charities, we're all in what our founder calls sugar sharing. So as far as free resources go, because I know that in addition to the TA, assistance is being provided, and there is, let me tell you guys, a plethora of information and resources that are being provided as a part of this process. Please take advantage. Show up for webinars or watch them on the replay. Meet one-on-one with a TA, because they're all amazing experts who can pour into you, and it's not costing you anything to do that, so that your organization can thrive beyond the Grassroots Fund. Grow Charity also has Green Elephant, which is a portal. It's free at the moment. And this is where you can find from templates to additional webinars to additional resources that will assist grassroots organizations specifically organizations that are serving BIPOC communities or that are BIPOC led. So you're having a double whammy here, double information and lots of great information that's being provided for you at no cost. So take advantage of these opportunities that are being provided to you as well.
That's amazing. Thank you so very much. I just love to see all these different networks connecting and all the shout outs. Like you said, this is our passion. You know, we would show up for Grassroots